Welcome to another episode of WireWheel's Privacy Rollup, a weekly recap of newsworthy privacy updates from our CPO, Rick Buck. Hi, Rick. How are you doing today?
I'm well today, Janine. Thank you so much for hosting us again.
Yes, not a problem. Couple of things to talk about today. With the state privacy laws changing so rapidly and companies like Apple releasing iOS 14.5, which requires developers to install privacy preferences, one could say it's becoming confusing from a professional and consumer standpoint. What are your thoughts, or what are the thought leaders saying about this situation?
Yeah, it's a great question, Janine. So last week, iOS unleashed the 14.5 update. And as we all know, that update empowers consumers to accept or decline their preferences about the collection and use of their data for advertising. The initial data from what I've read, and I don't have an accurate number, but the adoption rates from consumers on saying yes to using their data has been overwhelmingly and resoundingly low. Consumers don't want their data being used. And that's just on iOS 14.5.
Yes.
So it's interesting to see how that's going to play out, and how it's going to have an impact on, do we need legislation? Will industry self-regulation fix all of our problems, or are we going to continue to rely on the law? As we think about the law, we've got here in the United States, two states right now that between them, have 2.5 laws. We have, CCPA, we have CPRA, we have CDPA. We have a dozen or so states that are in some state of flux right now for their state privacy legislation. And right now it's a little bit confusing, right? It's a confusing story to tell consumers. Is your data being protected? How do you protect yourself? What are your options? Do my state laws cover it? Is it some other law? How do I play this game? And then if I'm on the business side, even if I'm a privacy professional, there's a lot of work to be done. In the absence of one specific or one overriding federal law here in the States, it has the potential, as you've heard me say many weeks in the past, to get equally more confusing.
Ever changing, right? Minute on minute. All right. Well, speaking of that, which is definitely a nice transition, let's pivot a little bit to the pending privacy regulations for this week. It appears that privacy legislation has been reintroduced at the federal level. Tell us a little bit about the recent movement in that area.
Yep. So last week, Senator Moran from Kansas introduced the Consumer Data Privacy and Security Act, reintroduced it. He joins now, I think it's just one other. I'm sorry, there may be two, but Senator Delveni introduced a couple weeks ago the Information Transparency Personal Data Control Act, and both of these would be federal laws. In the most recent Kansas bill, they are approaching this from really the same lens, and as most of the bills are approaching this from the same lens that GDPR, CCPA, CDPA are thinking about. The bill, as it's written right now, has a lot of similar themes to those laws. It has consumer rights, it has protections, it has obligations on the part of the business. It appears to be written in a way that is going to be a little more favorable to small and mid-sized businesses. If it is passed, right now it would be a preemptive law. So it would preempt any of the assorted state privacy laws, much in the way that CAN-SPAM preempted all of the individual state spam laws.
Wow.
In terms of what it looks like and who it applies to, very familiar language. I think in many respects, this is a law that people would, at least as it's currently written, would understand. It applies, I'm getting tongue-tied here, sorry people. It applies to all people living in the US. It applies to all businesses that are under the purview of the FTC, including nonprofits.
Mhm.
And as I mentioned, it's got some carve outs for small businesses, and it exempts them from honoring individual rights to access and individual rights to accuracy and correction. And the small businesses that would qualify for this exemption would be businesses that have less than 500 employees, businesses that have less than $50 million in gross receipts is the terminology for the previous 3 years,
Mhm.
or businesses that collect or process personal data of less than 1 million individuals. So pretty liberal definition of what a small to mid-sized business is, who would
Yes.
be exempt from, at least from these two consumer rights obligations. From a service provider point of view, service providers are also exempt from this law. So if you are a processor versus a controller of data, you would be exempt, but you'd have obligations that once your contract with the data controller was over, that you would have to destroy or return the data that belonged to the data controller. So interesting
Right.
note there. Much like GDPR, CCPA, it has a definition for what personal data is. And this law talks about identifying or linking or reasonably linking data to a specific person. And that includes a lot of the usual suspects like name or postal address, email address, your social security number, your driver's license, things that we would associate with that kind of definition.
Right.
In terms of obligations on the business, comes with consumer rights, the right for knowing what kind of categories are being collected, the right to know what that information is being used for, what third parties you're sharing it with, that data is kept accurate, that you have the ability to correct it, that you have the ability to delete it, and then of course, the data portability functionality as well. From a notice point, from a business obligation point, again, things that I think people should be pretty comfortable with. But you need to tell people what kind of data you're collecting about them and how you're using it. One interesting point about this language is that they're saying that either explicit or implicit consent needs to be gathered before you can use personal data.
Right.
But it doesn't say one way or another that implicit or explicit is the way to go. Implicit meaning if you don't opt out or there's a pre-check box, that might be considered implicit or implied consent. The opposite of that would be check off a box or confirming your an email that you want to be opted in would be examples of explicit consent. So interesting to see that they've put that hook into this on a national level. And then obviously there needs to be privacy notice that gives easy access to your rights, and that obviously, like most of the bills, that the appropriate security measures are put in place. And in this case in particular, the law, the way it's written, is requiring a data privacy officer. It'll be enforced by the FTC. State attorneys general will have the ability to file class action suits. And so lots of moving parts that seem familiar to us. But it is federal bill number 2. Where it goes, which bill wins, will more bills be introduced? I feel like I should be saying something at the end of the Batman cartoon where, stay tuned next week, same bad time, same bad channel, right? So we'll see where this all goes. It's good that there's a national discussion on this.
Yes.
It's good to see that, both from a legislative point of view, that there's energy behind this, but it's also good to see when the industry steps up and puts in its own self-regulation, how consumers are reacting to it. So the confluence of those two things, I think, will make for very interesting conversation on the way we think about privacy in the coming year and coming years ahead.
Well, it's certainly extremely interesting. And the one thing it does say, because of all the moving pieces and the complexity of this, it just behooves any professional in the privacy space or that comes anywhere near the privacy space, as well as consumers, to make sure that they stay on top of all of these changes. So, I would say viewers of this video should definitely stay tuned for these weekly updates.
Yes, indeed. And WireWheel is here to help.
Yes. So that being said, I want to thank you, Rick, for this week's update. And I'd also like to thank our viewers for tuning in to WireWheel's weekly privacy roll-up. And if you have any privacy questions you'd like to ask, just reach out to us at marketing@wirewheel.io. And you'll also be able to find the link in the description below. And be sure to like this video and subscribe to WireWheel's YouTube channel as well. Again, thank you for your time today. And thanks, Rick.
Thanks again for hosting, Janine. Thanks everybody for listening. We'll see you next week.
Thanks.